everyone. I'm Beatrice Traub-Werner. I was born and raised in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I came to Canada in 1970 as a pretty young person with my husband, who was intending to become a resident in psychiatry, and then we were going to return home. Well, 53 years later, here we are. I became a social worker by training in 1984, and among my students, when I was working at my faculty as an administrator and an adjunct professor, was Tania Molina. A few years after she graduated, and she had become the executive director, and in 2009 she approached me wondering whether I could help her to provide the academic portion of the bridging program. Tania, who was really a visionary leader, had understood that for new Canadians, one of the biggest challenges is not to lose the skills that they brought here. Because one of the big issues is, to this very day, 50-some years later, nothing much has changed. And if you become a professional anywhere in the world, coming to work here is barriers and hurdles and more barriers and more hurdles. So at the Mennonite at the time, this was a mainly, I think exclusively, Spanish-speaking agency. It dealt with people from all over Latin America, and the issues you can imagine at the time were very many, not the least of which were the mental health issues, with almost nobody available to do the work in Spanish. Very, very few. I knew practically everybody who did, if you can imagine that. So Tania had a great idea. In order to reduce the wait list, and in order to ensure that the folks that came with the skills to do the work in psychotherapy did not get de-skilled while waiting to get the degree and the whatever approval, she started a program in psychotherapy for Spanish-speaking people. The therapists were the therapists that came with the degrees and were waiting to get themselves recertified. Their supervisor was Eva Sapir, sadly no longer with us. She supervised all of these folks, and Tania was one of the few executive directors providing mental health services at the time who could boast of the fact that she had no wait list. There was no wait list. And there were some very innovative, very interesting programs, group programs for women, for young mothers, for seniors, lots of work with seniors. Not many agencies were dealing with seniors. So this is one of the strengths of the Mennonite. At the time, services were provided to just about everybody in the population, from children to seniors, going through young adults. Newcomer services of the very best. So that was the way that things began. There weren't more than 5 people really truly involved in this. I had a small team on my side helping me to develop what was the academic portion of the program, because we had from January to September to get started. By September, it had to be rolled out. We had no admissions process that we could say, this is how one does it. We just had to invent it as we went, and it was a really hard work, but a lot of fun. Tania and I really, really enjoyed it. I think she had many more sleepless nights than I did, because she was also in charge of the money, which I wasn't. And of course, managing the money was, of course, always a very, very important big deal. And having the systems in place to be accountable. Because when the government gives you money, they don't just give you money. They want, if you're buying paper clips, you better show that you bought paper clips. So, and we were buying a whole lot of stuff. We were having to pay instructors. We were having to pay directors of programs, and so on and so forth. We didn't have much equipment. As I say, we didn't even have a photocopier. The other big challenge, as I remember now, was space. Where do we do this? At the Queen Street site, there just wasn't the space at the time. It was way, way, way too small. So she found a space on Keele Street, Keele at Wilson, and to this day it still exists. But I think it's not used nearly as much as we used it. It was a humming place. There was so much coming and going there. We also made a mistake when we began, in that we had a part-time program and a full-time program going at the same time with 30 people each, at least 30. So we were going a little berserk. It was too many people, managed by too few people for a very brief period of time, because we only had a few months to get all of the information in. And then the practicum piece was, of course, hugely challenging, because where do you find 60 practicum? I mean, even finding 30 these days is hard. So that was, we started out too big, too fast, and then we learned. We learned along the way a lot on how to make this more efficient, better run, more interesting for the students, and so forth. Because we weren't really certain about who would be the best candidates, we didn't know. So if you told us that you had done some psychotherapy, even if you were a thoracic surgeon, we'd take you. But that didn't fly very well, as you can imagine, because thoracic surgeons nowhere in the world know much about mental health. So we had a few such blips. But it just spoke to the desperation of so many to get back into the profession, some professions, somehow. And so this was an avenue. And some of these folks really actually doubled down and went about the business of learning how to work in the mental health system and understand what is included and what you need to know in providing mental health services. For the physicians, it was a very, very big challenge, and we had many, because again, everybody knew at the time that even if they arrived with the best of intentions and all the experience in the world, getting to become a physician in Ontario again is, to this day, still hugely challenging, and there are very, very few who actually make it. So some of them actually stuck with the program and are working to this day. Well, you know, we had learned from some of the other professions, because there had been a few bridging programs ahead of ours in architecture, in engineering. There was some evidence, but not a whole lot, that the programs worked. Well, I could tell you, now it's many years later, but at the time, we very quickly realized that without the bridging program, our folks would have a very hard time finding work in the system. And although today it is much more common for people to work in private practice, in those days it wasn't. The money wasn't there, the insurance companies weren't really prepared. Mental health today is essentially out of the closet. It wasn't in those days. We didn't talk about mental health. It was one of those things that hush, hush, hush. So the evidence is absolutely incontrovertible. Without the bridge training program, folks do not find work in the system, because the point of teaching what we taught, it was not about teaching the actual content, because most folks came knowing. I mean, that's something that they learned in their programs back home, wherever they came from. It's what words one uses here, how one says it here. We had a component that we didn't call English language skills. Tracy Dochev was one of the first, she was the first teacher. But it was because it felt offensive to those who had actually been taught in English. The purpose was to teach folks how to write the way we write reports here, the words we use, and of course all of the legislative requirements, the whole business about confidentiality, informed consent, all of those ethical imperatives. You know, you probably think ethics is ethics internationally, same old. No. It's very, very culturally based. And the ethics of practice in this part of the world are different than the ethics of practice anywhere else. And there isn't a book that's going to teach you the difference between what it would have been like if you'd been a psychotherapist in New Delhi to what it would be like to be a psychotherapist in Toronto with a very multicultural clientele. That was the other thing that was absolutely mind-blowing for us and for everybody in the classes, is they had never worked, most had never ever worked with such a heterogeneous group of classmates. And when I mean worked, we had scenarios where the students played roles. And so all of a sudden, your values really came through. I remember a time when a group of students actually left the classroom because we were talking about the rights of women and women who were not necessarily binary. And for some folks, it was a really big challenge to understand that in this part of the world, regardless of your own personal beliefs, everyone deserves to be treated equally. And as a professional, you can't pick and choose. Whoever knocks at your door is your client, and it is regardless of everything. That was hugely challenging and at times very difficult for us to navigate. You know, it's a bit different if you come on your own timing with your own agendas. Very different if you're a refugee. So those are two, I think, separate questions, and I will respond to the refugee part first. There are not enough services for refugee newcomers, and our refugee newcomers are having a very hard time everywhere in this country because we have nowhere to house them. Actually, that is exactly the same situation that everyone else is encountering, and it's not just newcomers to this country, it's everybody is having a very hard time finding affordable housing. So that is huge. So one of the things that makes immigration slightly easier is if you can find community quickly. People who support you, who understand it because they've been there. It's funny how one doesn't ever really forget what it was like. So I remember when I arrived, someone said to me, "It'll take you 5 years." And I thought, really? 5 years? How can it take so long? It really took 5 and then some before I understood where I was. You know, you're driving down these streets and you think, what is this? Who is this? In a crowd, you're looking for your aunt, for your family member, the next door neighbors, nobody's there. So it takes that time until you finally find people that you know in the crowds. Well, I think that is becoming much more of a challenge, as we have become very much more of an individualistic society, where I look after myself and my next door neighbor. I may not even know who they are. And I may be living next door to my neighbor for I don't know how many years in an apartment building, and beyond saying hi and bye, maybe, at the elevator, I have no idea who they are. So that's why I think it is important to be part of community, because it is those that came before you and from your own community that are more likely to extend a hand. Not always, but often. There's two parts to your question. I think I would like to wish MNLCT at least another 40 highly successful years. The way this organization has grown is incredible. The work it does is really stellar in every aspect of it. It has also gone through some incredible challenges, as all not-for-profits always do, mainly having to do with funding. And so I'm hoping for a very, very, very wealthy donor to endow the center with the kind of money that would permit it to do the work it does without having to worry about where's the money going to come from. So that would be my dream wish. So it doesn't hurt to dream. So let's dream big. And for the clients, I think the clients are very lucky to have a place like the MNLCT that is there for them in so many different ways. It doesn't matter what the issues are that you bring. There's always somebody in there who has some idea about what to do in order to make the situation better. And that is a wonderful legacy.